The United States is the fattest nation in the industrialized world, with 1/3 of adults clinically obese. Why aren't politicians doing more to address the problem? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ritansi. The National Insitutes of Health estimate obesity is the second leading cause of preventable death in the United States. And it's suggested that by 2030, over 40% of the population will be clinically obese. It's a problem that costs the US healthcare system nearly $150 billion a year. The issue isn't lacking in national attention. First Lady Michelle Obama has called obesity a national security threat and launched various initiatives to promote healthier eating. New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg has banned the sale of so-called big gulp, large-size sodas in his city. But politicians do seem loath to introduce legislation to counter obesity. The food industry has certainly spent millions of dollars lobbying politicians over the years. What's more, the food lobby is also sponsoring supposedly independent groups like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. Al Jazeera's Kimberly Halkett has been examining the influence of the food and drink industry in Washington.
The standard American diet is relatively inexpensive, convenient, and satisfying. Whether it's highly marketed fast food or highly processed packaged foods in the supermarket, what Americans eat has changed dramatically over decades. And it shows. The U.S. has the highest rate of obesity in the industrialized world.
It is really expensive to get healthy food in the U.S.
Fast food is much too accessible.
The government can stop the advertisements, can stop all the bad foods, yet they let it keep going and then they complain about obesity.
It's true. The American diet is shaped a lot by what happens here in the U.S. Congress. The food and beverage industry has for the past 2 decades spent tens of millions of dollars lobbying for government regulations that favor its finances.
The economics are a big part of it, no doubt about it. Food companies are in business to make money.
One unfavorable policy could cost a company millions, so former government food policymaker turned lobbyist John Bodie works to keep food regulations at a minimum. It is a major effort. Since 1990, the food and beverage industry has been one of America's biggest political campaign donors, paying out nearly $107 million to both presidential and congressional political campaigns. Last year, $24 million was given to politicians running for Congress. 71% went to Republicans, 29% went to Democrats. In turn, many of those politicians have voted to keep food industry costs low. Since the mid-1990s, $17 billion has gone to crops like corn and soybeans, mainstay ingredients of the junk food industry. Contrast that to just $260 million in subsidies for healthier menu options, like apples or vegetables.
Saving a few bucks.
And despite mounting data suggesting processed food can lead to obesity, lobbyists have also convinced lawmakers to back voluntary guidelines rather than laws on things like food advertising.
If we start regulating in ways that outlaw various foods, what we're really doing is we're denying consumers choice.
Those who need to have lobbyists on Capitol Hill are those who come under criticism for the kinds of products they make and the damage they potentially do.
Damage which could only get worse, critics fear, given the policies which generally favor food industry wallets, not consumer health. Kimberly Halkett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
We're joined from San Francisco by Michelle Simon, a public health lawyer who is president of Eat, Drink Politics, a consulting firm that campaigns to improve public health. And from Minneapolis, Bruce Bradley is a former food industry executive who worked for companies including General Mills, Pillsbury, and Nabisco. We also asked a number of food industry bodies and lobbyists to appear on the program. Those unable to take part included the American Beverage Association, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Grocery Manufacturers Organization, and the Center for Consumer Freedom. Michelle Simon, then in some ways perhaps we've come to expect enormous amounts of corporate lobbying and influence on Capitol Hill, but your group has just come out with a report which is a bit more startling perhaps in that it looks at the links between the food industry and nutrition professionals. We have a potted summary of it here, which I'll just quickly go through. You're focusing in particular on the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and it listed 38 industry sponsors in 2011 in its annual report. That's nearly 4 times higher than in 2001. Processed food giants ConAgra and General Mills have been sponsors for 10 of the last 12 years. The Academy's list of approved continuing education providers include Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Kraft Foods, and Nestle. Amongst the courses listed, one sponsored by Coca-Cola said that sugar is not harmful for children. The report accuses the Academy of staying away from lobbying for nutrition policies that might upset corporate sponsors, such as limits on soft drink sizes, soda taxes, and labeling for genetically modified foods. Perhaps we can begin, Michelle. I mean, what is the function of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics?
Well, they're an important organization. The reason I chose them to focus on is that they represent 74,000 registered dietitians. These are nutrition professionals who are really on the front lines of the nation's diet-related chronic disease epidemic. So these are professionals whose job it is to teach Americans how to eat right. Now, they have an impossible job to begin with because of all the reasons that your introduction explained. But what I showed is how the very food companies that are causing these diet-related chronic diseases are influencing this huge organization by way of their annual meeting, and I attended it twice. It's a huge junk food exhibition, and also by way of continuing education. So like you mentioned, the Coca-Cola sponsored educational programs that these registered dietitians are learning. And this is part of the explanation for why Americans aren't getting the straight information they need about how to eat right, when the very professionals who are supposed to tell them that information are being influenced by America's largest food companies.
Well, what's the stated rationale for having these partnerships with industry?
Sure. Well, you know, if you ask them, they will say things, the Academy will say things like, well, we need to have food industry at the table, we need to have dialogue with them, our professionals work with these companies to improve their food products. But really, do we need Hershey's chocolate to be a major sponsor of this organization? I don't see any improvement there, right? I mean,
but can they not be part of the solution, though? Can they not be part of practical solutions to combat obesity?
I haven't seen that. Look, that's what the food industry, that's the tune that we've been hearing from the food industry for years, right? I wrote my book in 2006 about the food industry claims to be part of the solution. So here we are 6, 7 years later, and the nation's chronic disease is only getting worse. So if you show me evidence of how exactly the food industry being at the table and how working with them and having them be part of the solution is actually having any measurable benefit to America's public health, then let's talk about it.
Well, the Academy did decline to join us for this discussion, but we do have a statement from the president of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. It says that your report, quote, is a mixture of facts, most of which were obtained from publicly accessible pages on the Academy's website, and opinion and speculation on the author's part. The report consists of publicly available facts filtered through the author's opinions. She is, of course, entitled to her opinions, but opinions are not facts. Let me make it clear that the Academy does not tailor our messages or programs in any way due to influence by corporate sponsors, and this report does not provide evidence to the contrary. Michelle Simon.
Okay, so this is a typical tactic, ironically or not, well honed by the food industry, which is to attack the messenger. In this case, the Academy, instead of responding to the very real problems that not only I have pointed out, but many others, including Marion Nessel, for many years, others have pointed out this conflict of interest. Instead of dealing with that problem, they're attacking me, right? And they're saying that I have an agenda and I'm biased and all this name calling, when really they haven't addressed the very real problems that the report points out and just illuminates that others have pointed out for years. And it's really sad. And many of the concerns are being raised by this organization's own members. Okay, so it's not just me, it's many others, and really they are just trying to distract away from the core problem that they know they have.
Bruce Bradley, as someone who has worked in big food for some time, how do you think Coca-Cola and Kraft and Nestle and others, and the National Dairy Council for that matter, how do you think they view a partnership such as the one that Michelle Simon has examined with the Academy?
Well, they look at it as a huge opportunity to add credentials to their products, to make them seem healthier. I mean, what would sound better than to have a soft drink in partnership with nutrition professionals? And I think it's that type of visible or image to a consumer that is pretty appalling. I mean, and to your question earlier to Michelle, if you even just look at pictures, photographs of these A&D events, to see the huge sponsorship, stations in these at these events where Coke and all the other big food and beverage companies are featured, you just sort of have to scratch your head and go, okay, I can guess there's a role for soft drinks and for candy in my life, but should they really be taking such a prominent role in in a nutrition and dietetic association? And I just scratch my head and I go, no. I mean, they're obviously trying to influence dietitians, and they're trying to portray themselves as healthier foods when they're not.
Right, but I mean, that would then assume that they have absolutely no interest in the health and welfare of their customers. Is there any interest in health? Is it purely profit-driven? Surely they must know they can't kill us all off.
Big food and beverage companies are very short-term oriented. If you've worked in a big company like I have in several of those big food companies, it's about quarter-to-quarter profits. And the thought or concern of long-term health consequences isn't on their radar. They're concerned that their products are safe and don't kill anybody in the moment. But what sort of health ramifications it leads to in a consumer 15, 20, 30 years later, it's not on their radar.
So what, you mean they could just be selling footballs as they are food then?
Well, they're selling food, but they're selling it to make money. I mean, that is clearly what they're doing. And while they may talk a lot about being concerned about public health, I mean, the proof are in the numbers. I mean, the upfront to your report, the numbers are staggering, the rates of obesity. And the industry has been talking about being involved and talking about being at the table and wanting to help. But if they're honestly wanting to help, whatever they're doing isn't working. It's clearly going the wrong direction, and they need to reevaluate exactly what they're doing, because our problem's getting worse and worse and worse. And I believe it's honestly more just a whitewash to look like they're trying to help the problem, when in actuality they're just trying to keep regulation as minimal as possible, so they have as much license to sell their products in the way they want to sell their products.
But Michelle, I mean, you point out that many members of the Academy are also against a lot of this corporate sponsorship. That suggests, though, that this isn't a very successful way to pull the wool over the eyes of nutritionists. They can see quite plainly that when Coca-Cola sponsors a lecture on the benefits of low-calorie sweeteners, that might not be the most objective lecture in the world.
Well, but part of what I found in my report is that it's not always clear the industry influence. So at the conference itself, for example, they wouldn't necessarily disclose in the program that McDonald's was on the agenda. So you would show up to the session, and then there would be a presenter from McDonald's, and they would have to disclose, obviously, when they were presenting. But the influence goes deeper than just disclosure. It's really about a culture. So while you might think, well, if an RD, registered dietitian, signs up for a Coca-Cola sponsored webinar, then they know it's influenced. But the thing is that this academy, by partnering with these major food and beverage companies, are normalizing the very idea of partnering with them and normalizing the idea that legitimate scientific information comes from the likes of Coca-Cola. And so why shouldn't RDs believe the information being presented by the Coke-sponsored MD who says sugar is not a problem for children, aspartame A-OK, right? These are the messages that are coming from Coke that are being endorsed by the Academy, and that's a problem.
If we were to widen this out then to academic research in general, I mean, we know that there's a Mars chair in development nutrition at UC Davis, or at least there was. I mean, does that mean that any study that might have the slightest hint of corporate sponsorship is worthless? Can that really be true, though, Michelle?
Well, there actually has been some scientific research on the bias of corporate-sponsored research. And one review in particular showed that, in fact, when you have, for example, the beverage industry, as they have, pay for numerous research studies related to the connection between consuming soft drinks and obesity, guess what? Those studies are biased in industry's favor. In contrast, when you have independently funded research, not so much. So there's no question that there is a scientific bias coming out of research that is funded by industry, as has been shown over and over. And it's no wonder, right? Because industry has a vested interest in the outcome of that science. So whether it's in how the scientists design the research or perhaps in not being published, as we know, there's a publication bias. In other words, when you have positive outcomes, industry is more likely to get that kind of study published and promote it. Okay, so there's no question there's an influence. It's not to say that all science is bad if it has any taint of industry in it, but we know that the trend is towards bias from industry-sponsored research.
Bruce Bradley, would a corporation leave it to chance then that a study may end up with any results that were unfavorable to its interests?
When corporations, these big food corporations, are participating in these studies, they're very carefully designed and they're set up for success, at least in the food company or beverage companies.
But what about the universities, though?
Well, they're working with those universities to pretty much set up the results. They have a good understanding of the different variables that they're looking at, and they've constructed the study in such a way that most likely it will bear results that are positive on their food or beverage. I mean, let's face it, these companies have a fiduciary responsibility to act in the benefit of their shareholders. And so if they're going out and fielding research that would act to the detriment of their shareholders, legally they could get in trouble for that as well. So, to believe that, I won't say that all corporate research should be ignored, but there is a definite bias towards this research. And the cards are stacked in a certain way so that it most likely will shed a favorable light on their products.
Let's try and connect this up then to the report we showed a little earlier about corporate lobbying on Capitol Hill. To what extent is perhaps questionable academic research, questionable sponsorship of professional organizations then affecting legislation, or perhaps the lack of legislation, would you say, Michelle?
I would say it is more the latter. In other words, what these companies are doing when they fund a hugely influential group like the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics is essentially buying silence. So that means when there is an important policy proposal on the table, like the one you mentioned in your intro, Mayor Bloomberg's proposal to limit the size of sugary soft drinks in New York City, a reasonable public health idea, to 16 ounces, twice the normal size of a serving size. And when that proposal is on the table, you expect the nation's leading group of nutrition professionals to perhaps even endorse the idea, like every other leading health organization has. And yet, the Academy has not only not endorsed the New York City proposal, they put out a press release in the height of the controversy around it saying they did not endorse it and that they wanted to study the issue further. It's all fine to be, scientific about your approach to policymaking, but really what they're doing is delaying taking a position on a crucial policy that is on the table. And even if they are not being influenced by Coca-Cola, certainly the appearance is there. So by partnering with Coca-Cola, whatever their legitimate policy positions might be one way or the other, there is this question lingering over them all the time.
As far as research is concerned, though, Bruce Bradley, clearly then a lot depends on the regulatory agencies who are looking at some of these issues as well. Are they cognizant? Presumably they must be, though, of who's sponsoring some of this research as they make decisions on what is acceptable food policy.
Yes, they're cognizant of who's involved in the research, but oftentimes the people in these regulatory agencies are former big food people as well. And so the level of influence it's at all levels. If it's from medical professionals to associations like the A&D to the regulatory. The big food and beverage companies have done an excellent job of influencing at all levels. And that's on top of advertising to consumers who are already generally either confused or misled about what's truly in their food. So the food industry and beverage industry have done a tremendous job creating a whitewashed world where what's actually in our food or drink is very confusing to your average consumer.
And I suppose, Michelle, this is why you often, I think, have written about how the argument, it usually devolves into a question of personal responsibility. But of course, it's very difficult to take responsibility if we haven't a clue what is actually in our food in the first place.
The height of industry's hypocrisy is to be saying that the solution to this problem is personal responsibility on one hand, while on the other hand, they're hiding the very information that consumers need to make intelligent decisions. So, you know, for example, for years they didn't want to post calorie counts to menus in chain restaurants. Well, now that's changing. But the point is they obstruct for decades common sense policies to give consumers more information while they say, oh, really, it's just up to individuals to make the right choice.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. I mean, personal choice implies that you have the information to make that decision. You know, I'm an economics major from college, and you know, it assumes perfect information. And your average consumer does not have perfect information. They have a one-sided point of view about what's in their food, and so much is hidden about it or distorted about what's in their food that there's no way they could possibly make an informed choice. So yes, I agree every consumer has the right to choose, but let's give consumers the information they need so they can make a choice, an informed choice for themselves. I don't want to control anybody's access to food or what they eat, but I do want them to really understand what they're eating.
I mean, a big issue right now is the Food and Drug Administration looking like it's about to give the go-ahead to genetically modified salmon in the US. Michelle, as we look at the sort of research that they considered as they made that decision, I mean, should we be concerned that they had all the, that everything they were considering was what they needed to consider in making that decision?
Right. Well, it's a good example of really relying on industry information. So the Food and Drug Administration, I always emphasize, really, it's hard to blame them too much for the decisions they make when the budget that they are given year to year for food safety, for oversight over all of the different areas that they have jurisdiction over is so lacking. And this is also industry's game, right, to starve the beast, so to speak. So to not allow enough funding to flow through these agencies that need to do their own oversight over a critical issue like GE salmon. So instead, they're relying on the science provided by industry, which of course is biased, as we've been talking about. And so, of course, industry saying, oh, no problem here, just approve this product. And by the way, don't label it, which is another controversy, of course, that's been going on for years. So industry wants to say there's no problem, everything's fine. Oh, by the way, we're patenting this technology, but we don't think it really makes much of a difference enough for consumers to know that this technology is being used in the food they're eating. And so if this goes through, this will represent the very first animal product that consumers will be eating that is genetically engineered. And you won't know about it unless we get labeling passed, which of course is an ongoing effort.
But once again, Bruce, I mean, surely there is some interest in looking at the long-term effects on the health and the environment of genetically modified food, because again, the blowback would be enormous if it turned out that these organisms were indeed lethal.
Again, these companies are very short-term focused. They've promised some profits to Wall Street, and they're about delivering those profits in the short term. That 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, that's somebody else's problem to these executives and these managers who are running the businesses. It's not. It's they're worried about next quarter's numbers, and in the case of genetically engineered salmon, they're interested in selling this product now. They're not worried about the consequences 15 or 20 years down the road.
Very quickly then, Michelle, Simon, President Obama came in, the First Lady came in, really talking about new campaigns. The response from the lobbies, as has been documented, was ferocious, enormous amount of money being channeled into Washington. Your side of the argument does seem to be losing this. I mean, what are the strategies you're employing to try and fight against such enormous power?
Well, the good news is there is a growing movement. And, the Obama administration, unfortunately, has been largely a failure when it comes to regulating the food industry. These issues are not going away. People are continuing to demand more information about the food they're eating, demanding healthier food. The marketplace will have to respond to that. And although ultimately we do need government to join us in the fight to better regulate industry to provide a healthier food supply for all Americans.
Michelle Simon, thank you very much. Bruce Bradley, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.